So my name's Mary Drewnoski. I'm a beef systems specialist with the University of Nebraska. And today I got tasked with answering the question of when to harvest small grain silage. And if we're thinking about winter hardy species, which species should I plant? So if we look at the data that we have related to using winter hardy small grain silages and comparing wheat, triticale, and rye, we don't see huge differences in terms of yield or quality among the species if we harvest them at the same relative maturity stage. Now, what we did see is some differences in terms of when they hit those stages. So there are differences among varieties within species. Actually, in one year we planted Ryman rye, and it actually ended up hitting stages about the same time as the triticale did. But if we plant like a southern rye, it'll be a week earlier at each stage than, say, triticale or wheat. If we look at dry matter yield here of the three species, we see they really don't separate until we get into the late stages or soft dough stage. So that's really like mid-June. And at that point, we did see triticale kind of pull away from the rye, and the rye do a little bit better, of course, than the wheat. And one of the things that we saw with the wheat was, in this case, it was an Arapaho wheat, but it actually did lose some dry matter yield going to soft dough because we lost some leaf. So we had some senescence or some death of the leaves. They dried up, they fell off, and so we didn't actually capture that yield. So in that case, if I'm going earlier in stages of harvest, anywhere from basically mid-May, which is when we hit boot, so that's before the head comes out, to that time frame of about early June, where we are at milk, or where they actually have a seed head, and that seed actually, if you were to take the seed out and just press it, you'll get a milky white substance come out. Really, no real differences between the species. It isn't until we get into where that seed actually is in a doughy stage that we see any differences. So from that standpoint, I think the selection really looks like triticale or rye in this case. If we look at just stage now, and we look at what's going on with the actually the quality, so the TDN, or the energy content, the digestibility, what we see is that the earlier stages, as you'd expect, have much higher energy. They're more digestible because we have less plant cell wall. And as we go into milk stage, we kind of hit our bottom. So depending on what type of animal you're shooting for, you may want to go earlier to get higher quality, or go later to get more yield. So in this case, the one thing that really does stick out is that milk is probably the scenario that's the least desirable, because it actually has the lowest TDN, and if you wait a little bit longer, usually another 7 days or so to soft dough, you'll actually gain more yield and more energy. So you'll get actually both. The only problem with that scenario is that as you look at our crude protein contents going from that early boot stage, so pre-heading, all the way out to soft dough, we lose protein content. So again, depending on your goals, you might select a different stage. So boot stage actually had protein contents that were very similar to alfalfa. So there are some producers that even are feeding it to beef cows or growing calves that will shoot for boot, give up a little bit of dry matter yield, or a lot of dry matter yield, to use it as a protein supplement. If you're looking for more of a full feed situation, you might go a little bit later stages to gain more yield and have a little bit lower protein content. The lowest protein content we see is somewhere around 8 to 10% crude protein. I should point out all of these crops had 40 pounds of nitrogen added to it, and that does make a difference in terms of what we see in terms of protein contents. And this year, we all know protein's expensive, so we've got to think about the yield boost we get. If you are doing small cereals and you're going to be harvesting later, like that milk or soft dough stages, you're going to see more of an advantage of having that extra nitrogen on that crop. So this actually is looking at the nutrient yield per acre basis. So basically we just took the dry matter yield and then the nutrient content and merge those two together, because depending on your goals, you may want to be maximizing, for instance, the amount of energy per acre you're getting. And you can see that as we let those plants get more mature, because we're getting more dry matter yield, that we are actually getting more total TDN. So the concentration of TDN decreases, or the amount of energy concentration decreases, but total yield is actually increasing. So a lot of feedlots might choose to delay until that mid-June time period at soft dough and get the highest TDN yield per acre. One of the other things you notice is that there's really no difference in protein yield. So protein content decreased, the TDN or the dry matter actually increased, and so what we're actually seeing is that the amount of protein per acre that we're actually harvesting, so the number of pounds per acre of crude protein, really doesn't change across all those stages. We're just diluting it out as we get to later stages. And lastly, I just wanted to show you, we collected samples from 17 producers in Nebraska from their small cereals. And one of the key challenges that we saw was that about 40% of those samples actually were harvested and put into the silo too wet. With small cereals, we really do need to think about wilting, and for stages up to about soft dough, we actually probably have to wilt for a fairly significant period of time. But I think a lot of people underestimate how long it really does take to get it dry enough. So what you see here on this graph is actually the dry matter content at packing relative to the the TDN loss that they had from when they harvested through fermentation. So basically what that's saying is, how much energy did you lose while that silage was trying to ferment and get to a stable state? And this red circle is really showing you that when we had really low dry matters, so less than that 30, we started seeing increases in TDN loss, and that is because we had a different type of fermentation. We call it clostridial fermentation, and basically the bacteria that are digesting it are not helping us to really get down that low pH that we want to preserve it, and they're just eating up our feed. So we really do want to try to make sure we're managing for getting that correct dry matter so we can preserve more of that feed value that we're able to harvest.